And we have started recording. So Aisha, whenever you would like.
Okay. All right, Salam all, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Aisha Rahman. I see some familiar names in the chat box. It's so great to see all of you here with us today. It's afternoon here for me. I don't know if any of you all are coming from the West Coast. We have someone from Mexico City. That's awesome. But it's afternoon, it's sunny, and I'm just really excited to be coming to you all. This is my office line and my email address. I will be presenting today in my consulting capacity. I've been consulting with Heart for a long time now. I'm a big fan of Heart and the work that we all do, they all do at Heart. So if you need me beyond today, or if you have any follow-up questions for my presentation, please take note of my contact information. I'm happy, especially these days, happy to be responding to emails. So write it down.
So before Aisha begins, I will share a little bit about Heart, who we are, so that you can get a little bit of context of these webinar series. HEART is actually an acronym that stands for Health Education, Advocacy, Research, and Training. We are a national nonprofit. We are housed in Chicago, LA, DC, Virginia, and New York. So with our health education, advocacy, and research training, it's also our programming arm. So for health education, we do a lot of workshops and going to universities and schools. We do have a virtual resource center. We have our virtual peer educators, and we also have our heart-to-heart videos. With our advocacy programming arm, we do one-on-one advocacy as well as systems advocacy. And with our research programming arm, we collaborate with universities on research that is relevant to finding out and addressing the needs of the Muslim community as it relates to sexual violence and sexual health. And with our training programming arm, we do a lot of capacity building and technical assistance for Muslim leaders and also mainstream professionals that are working in this movement. At Heart, we are really committed to ensuring that all Muslims have the resources, language, and choice to nurture sexual health and confront sexual violence. And we're also really committed to a world where all people are free from sexual violence and thrive in the communities they live, work, and pray in. For us, also, 2020 marks quite an exciting year, as well as the fact that it's been an interesting year so far. But we've decided to go virtual, and it's something that we've been wanting to do for some time, and also we've been remotely working. And so with that being said, our virtual agreements. So what you'll notice is we have someone who is interpreting for us. This is Bernice. Bernice is also going to be joined by Janice. These two interpreters are going to be here for accessibility. And so you won't see Aisha Rahman or myself. My name is Nabila. I am part of the Heart team. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box. Here's some other rules that we wanted to go over. Your video and audio will remain off. The only people you will be interacting with will be us, either through like listening to us or by seeing the interpreters. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat function, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Also, if the time runs out, we will post remaining questions and answers on our social media, which if you haven't already started following, definitely feel free to do so. And also, all webinars are going to be recorded and shared. So again, it'll be shared in our social media. Yeah.
Okay, Thank you so much for that, Nabila. Just wanted to give a quick acknowledgement that this presentation today is supported in part by a grant from the Office on Violence Against Women, and that is an office at the Department of Justice. And Hart was given this grant to do these technical assistance trainings and outreach to underserved populations. And so we're really happy to have the support, but also want to mention that even though it was supported by the grant, the content is driven by me. This particular webinar is something that I created with the help of many people, which I will give attribution to, but they are not, they're my views. Okay, so goals and objectives. I think we can go to the next slide, Nabila. For today, we want to do a couple of things. I want to help to increase the cultural and religious responsiveness of leaders. All of you, I assume, are leaders, community members, friends, allies, activists who are trying to help make services to Muslim survivors of sexual assault more accessible, easier. This work needs to be a lot more inclusive, and we're hoping to help equip you all to help us with that. We want to provide more survivor-centric spaces in the community, which we'll talk a little bit about that, what it means. We want to help build a foundation of why supporting survivors is an obligation from a religious and cultural perspective. So shifting the narrative, sometimes we talk a lot, and we will today talk a lot about silencing of survivors, which is usually blamed on religious or cultural notions, but we're flipping that. We want you to understand why we believe supporting survivors is our duty and obligation. And lastly, we're going to try to understand how culture and religious traditions are misused to silence survivors. Don't know if all of you are repeats from last week, but we at Heart and in all the presentations that I do like to have some group norms. These group norms are really, whenever we're talking about something that is important to people. So for me, I am Muslim. My religion is very important to me. I'm going to be talking a lot about my culture and my religion today. And because of that, a lot of people feel that they can't ask certain questions because they fear that they're stereotyping or they fear that they might be offensive. So for me, and I'm not saying this for all of you in the chat box, but for me, no question is a bad question. Feel free to ask whatever you want and word it however you want. And I promise not to get too mad at you. But, of course, respect each other in the chat box as well, because we're really hoping with the chat functionality that you all get to know one another and talk to each other and create a community. And we want to be respectful. We're here to learn from each other. We want you to participate. If any of you feel strongly about adding your own group norms, feel free to use the chat box now to add your own group norms for today. I'm going to be checking the chat box, as Nabila mentioned, throughout the presentation. And so if I feel like we need to share anything aloud, I will read your messages. Okay, so speaking about participating, we're going to start with an opening exercise. So we're doing a couple of different things in this webinar. We're going to do asking for interaction in the chat box. We're also going to be having some polls where we ask you questions that will pop up in your presentation and you guys can answer. But this is not a poll question. This is actually just an opening exercise. We want you to use the chat box. And I want you to tell me some of the top misconceptions that you have or have heard about Muslims, particularly about Muslim survivors of sexual assault. So talk to me in the chat box. One of the reasons why I like to open with this exercise is I want to know what you all are experiencing. So I will introduce, while you guys are chatting and talking, I will introduce a little bit more about myself. I am a lawyer practicing law here in Atlanta, and I am working primarily with Muslim clients. My clients are diverse religiously and culturally, but I specialize in working with Muslim clients. And so I'm kind of inundated with my own stories, some of which I will be sharing with you all today. But I'm really curious about what you guys are experiencing in the field, because I am tied to one geographic location, and especially in this new role, I get a little bit of a flavor of what's happening around the country through my consulting, but not as much as I used to. So, okay, so we have a lot of great feedback from you all. The Muslim women who observe, let's see, that's not the first one, that Islam promotes marital rape, which it doesn't, thank you. That Muslim women observe hijab, don't get assaulted. That is a misconception. That the Muslim religion allows for violence against women, thank you. Have heard, obviously don't believe, that sexual violence is more common in Muslim communities. I've heard that as well. That all Muslim survivors do not report sexual assault because of the stigma around it, and also because of religious preferences. And then we have more about marital rape, that we have few resources because marital rape is not recognized as rape. We will be talking about resources and access to justice a little bit in the presentation. Survivors are disowned if they outcry about sexual violence, mistakenly believing a survivor. Okay. That women are the sexual property of their husband. I've heard that as well. That Muslim women are submissive and don't have rights. Oh, wow. You guys, there's so many messages. Okay. I'm not going to read all of these because these are all great. I'm just going to keep scrolling here. Muslim women are not in sexual relationships outside of marriage and therefore are not susceptible to SA. Thank you for that. Okay, keep talking, keep chatting. This is great. I want to make sure we continue this conversation, but I think these are all hopefully topics that we touch on today, and if we don't, we'll have to come back to it. All right, can we move to the next slide, Nabila? Okay. So before I get into the content, a couple more caveats. So because Islam is so important to me and it is such a significant part of my life, I don't want to limit myself and all of you to thinking that this presentation that is an hour is somehow comprehensive about Islam and Islam 101 or Islam on sexual violence. Islam is much bigger than that. It's going to take a lifetime of myself to study Islam and understand it. And so I know you all know that, but I want to make clear that this is not an Islam 101 class, but really it's just a teaser to kind of build awareness about the needs of Muslim survivors of sexual violence. So how does religion show up in addressing sexual violence? For me, so for all the things that you guys have mentioned, so you guys have already mentioned that religion comes up in the conversation of marital rape and whether it happens in Muslim communities. You guys have talked about stigma and whether that is real or perceived, and if it is real, is it coming from a religious perspective or not? You guys have talked about houses of worship, Muslim agencies, and mosques perpetuating silence, Sophia says. You guys have already talked a little bit about how religion is showing up in this work. How I believe that religion shows up even in the conversation of power and control. And I think one of you all mentioned that when you mentioned that, you know, husbands or men are, women are submissive to men, that's a power and control dynamic. That is a misconception that we want to debunk. And then I ask a couple of questions here. Have you all ever seen or used in your personal work religion as a factor in safety planning or as a way to design safety planning for the needs of your survivor? And I ask this question because and Erin says, yes, tell me how, Erin. I think that again, to change the narrative of religion always being this negative tool used against survivors, which absolutely is done, we want to shift the narrative a bit to say that, you know, it can be used as a positive, empowering tool. And I'm going to go ahead and answer my own question. I use religion as a factor in safety planning myself, and I'm curious about whether you all do that as well. And if you do, how do you do it? Okay, the chat box has gone a little silent, so I'm going to leave that question hanging in the air. Oh, here we go. Erin says, I try to take in the context of power and control, but always want to meet the survivor where he or she is. I want to empower them and they know, honor their religious preferences and give them options. That's great. A beautiful answer. I think that your answer really, and your approach really calls to attention what we're trying to get across in this presentation, which is really that we want to be survivor centric. We want to make sure that the survivor is the one who's talking about their, if it's religion, since we're talking about religion, how do they view their religion? If they view it as a tool that has been used against them, then maybe we don't want to trigger them by talking too much about religion. But if they have internalized that their religion may be oppressive, maybe we can educate, maybe we can disrupt that notion if we have the proper knowledge. And while none of us may be scholars or experts in any given faith, again, through this presentation, we're hoping to give you all a little bit of the knowledge that we have gleaned through our own research, particularly about Islam. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. I want you all to take a couple of seconds to, I'm going to read your chats while you do this, to read the first part of a case study. Just so you all know, throughout today's presentation, over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be going back and forth between the same case study. We're going to give you 5 parts to the story, and we're going to mix it up in the middle of my curriculum on Islam and sexual violence. And the reason why it may seem a little disruptive to you all, going from the case study back to content, but we're doing that because we're trying to highlight concepts while we're talking about them. So I want you all to read this first part of the case study, and then we will move forward. I just realized that our interpreters might need us to read the case study so that they can do the interpretation. So I'm going to go ahead and read it before we move on. Okay, so Susan is a Sunday school teacher at her local mosque. Taher is a youth coordinator at the same mosque. She is on site at the mosque all day for Sunday school, and sometimes the day before, she prepares materials and sets up the space. She bumps into Taher a few times, and he asks her about settling in. Susan reveals that she's a teacher and recently divorced, while Taher shares that he is married. He comments in response to Susan's revelation with, quote, "I can't believe you went through that, a beautiful and capable woman as yourself. And I'm here as a friend and colleague. If you need anything, here's my cell number." Susan gives him a puzzled look, to which he responds, "I mean, if you need anything for your Sunday classes," end quote. Okay, that's just the intro of the story. There's more coming. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So in our I always start with, and I want to give attribution to my teacher, Dr. Aziza El-Hibri. Many of you all may know her, should know her, are familiar with her work. She is the founder of an organization called Karama, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. I'm the former executive director of Karama, and I had the privilege of learning from her firsthand. She's written prolifically on issues of well, many things, but she's a lawyer herself, and she is a scholar of Islamic law. And she has written a lot about feminism and women's rights from an Islamic perspective, among other things. So she is, this part of the presentation comes from her. I believe that to best serve Muslim survivors, you need some baseline empowering knowledge. What do I mean by that? We need to go back to basics. The way that I was taught these issues is to go back to basics, which is to look at what is Islam really? What is the basis of Islam? And that is in our belief, the concept of tawheed, which reflects a deep monotheism in Islam. The way that Dr. El-Hibri explains a deep monotheism is she talks about, monotheism, you might think that it is or it isn't. What is the concept of a deep monotheism? Really, tawheed is the belief in the oneness of God. Here, let me type her name in because that's somebody else, I think. The oneness of God is a really, why is it important? Why are we going back to that very basic belief from an Islamic perspective? Well, Islam says, the Quran says about God that nothing is like him. He is supreme. He is the only one in control. There are 99 names of God that talk about all of his attributes. God is unlike anything that we know. It is not just the belief in the oneness of God, but in his sort of supreme uniqueness. There is nothing like God, and nothing can ever be compared to him or like him. I used him, by the way, as a pronoun in talking about God. I know that some might find that problematic, but that's just what I do. Why is that important? Why is this idea that God is the ultimate supreme power, the one in control, the one that is different than anything else? Well, I think it's very important in the context of sexual violence. Let's go to the next slide. Because power and control to me is a form of spiritual abuse. So continuing with this, going back to basics about Islam, I'm going to continue the story. So I don't know if all of you are familiar with the Quranic story of Satan and Adam, but I'll tell you the story briefly. And this is not even paraphrasing from the Quran. Please refer to the Quran for the authentic story. This is Aisha's retelling of the story. Essentially, God created Adam. There were already created beings at the time that God created Adam. Those created beings were angels. The angels, and one of the most fascinating passages in the Quran, there is a dialogue that happens between God and the angels when God creates Adam. And the angels are questioning God. They're asking God, why are you making this other creature? Why are you making Adam? And God says, I know what you don't know. And they said, well, he's going to shed blood on earth. That is what the angels said, which I think is a really interesting take, by the way. That's an aside, but an interesting take from the angels on what human beings are going to do. And essentially they're calling into question this idea of, aren't we enough for you? Angels in the Islamic belief are obedient to God. Their whole purpose in existing is to serve God and do God's bidding and do God's work. And they ask him, are we not enough for you? And God continues and says, I know what you don't know, meaning he has his own plan. And so once Adam is created, God asks the angels to bow to Adam. And amongst the angels is another being. His name in the Quran is Iblis, also known as Satan. Iblis is Iblis for the interpreters. So Iblis is hanging out with the angels, and he refuses to bow. Now, you all can chat in the chat box and tell me, what is the reason why, and I'm already giving it away, what is the reason why Satan refuses to bow to Adam? Does anyone know the Quranic story? Caitlin, I think you do know the Quranic story. Maybe you can tell us. Cynthia, beat you to it. Because he was made of fire. Amina says Iblis is ignorant because he thinks he's better than him. Yes, he's made of fire, and that's better. Adam was made of soil. So let me ask you guys this. Doesn't he have a point? I mean, fire gives you heat. It gives you power and energy. It gives you light. I mean, dirt is just dirt. It doesn't really do much. Doesn't he have a point? What do you guys think? Sophia says, yes, he has a point. Amna says, yes, he does have a point. Salwa says, but clay can be used to build things and fire only destroys things. Not necessarily. You can cook things on fire. You can use fire to warm your body and warm your home. Okay, well, you guys keep talking. So God is the one who made the determination. He is all-knowing. Thank you, Heather. Power corrupts. Valid point, but it was Allah's will to create. Well, I asked the rhetorical question. I actually don't think that Satan has a valid point. And I think that maybe I'm just trained to be against Satan. But I think that he was highlighting something to me that is the root of power and control. Sort of from an Islamic perspective, the very first time we saw power and control was this story, this instance in the Quran, where Satan has created a false hierarchy. He is, thank you, Aaron. He has created a false hierarchy. God did not say that fire is better than dirt. They both are different, but equal. They are different in their properties. They have different attributes. And it wasn't really for Satan. It was, as my friend here says, Danielle says, it's Allah's will. Yes. It was Allah's will or God's will to create how he wanted and create beings that are different from one another. It wasn't Satan's will to assert his power or superiority or this false hierarchy. And I do think it's a false hierarchy that unfortunately human beings have continued to perpetuate, saying that light skin is better than dark skin, saying straight hair is better than curly hair, saying whatever false hierarchies we as humans have created. There are many, many, many. Men are better than women. These are all examples of power and control. And Satan has committed the ultimate sin in Islam, which is that he's put his will above God's will. And what is that called? You guys can chat. What happens when you put your will above God's will? What is the only unforgivable sin in Islam? Shirk. Thank you. Okay. This is shirk. This is all of what you're talking, the arrogance, the submission, the idolatry, all of that is contributing to the concept of shirk. And shirk is S-H-I-R-K. So if Iblis has committed, by putting his will above God's will, by asserting his power and control over the situation above God's power and control, by questioning that God is the supreme power, nothing is like him, and questioning that power and control, the only one who has power and control is God. Iblis has committed the ultimate sin. And now I argue, that anyone who commits sexual violence or domestic violence is committing an Iblisi sin or a satanic sin, what Satan has done. That is what they are doing. So I'm likening sexual assault to this story. And with that, I will go to the next part of the story of the case study, and I'm going to read it aloud. Okay, I think we're switching our interpreters. So hopefully we've switched and I can go on to the second part of the case study. Susan is working one Sunday when two of her assistants called in sick. She decides to combine the classes together so that 40 kids are working under 2 adults. Just as she is scrambling to figure out what to do, Tahir walks into the room and offers to stay and help. The class runs smoothly, and when the last student and staff leaves around 6 p.m., Susan begins to gather her belongings and leave. Tahir walks in and announces, "I really saved the day, huh?" To which Susan agrees and heads to the door. Tahir walks towards her saying, "What's the rush? Why don't we grab some dinner? I'm sure you're hungry." Susan declines and attempts to walk around him, but he blocks her and grabs her arm. "Let's go," Susan shouts, to which Tahir slaps her across the face and throws her down to the ground. "You should be used to being treated like this anyway," he says, and attempts to pin her down. Susan rolls away, grabs her bags, and runs out of the mosque towards the door, shaking. And we have a poll for you all to answer from this case study. Please tell us which of the following seems to be true based on what's happening in this part of the case study. Do you think Tahir is intentionally helping Susan as a grooming tactic to appear like the good guy? Do you think Tahir's response was just anger in the moment because Susan dismissed his dinner offer? Do you think Susan does not give consent for Tahir to touch her? Do you think he assaulted her or abused her or sexually assaulted her? Or do you think that Tahir has more power because of his physical and emotional presence? Give you guys another minute.
Mm-hmm. We're at like 49%. We're at 70%.
Okay. Okay, let's see what you guys think. 85% of you feel that Tahir physically assaulted Susan. The next highest percentage was 74% of you think that Tahir intentionally helped Susan as a grooming tactic to appear like the good guy. I think that that's probably true. I think these are tricky polls because you can only pick one, but I know that's hard because there may be a couple of things true here. 69% think Susan did not give consent. 65% that he emotionally abused Susan. Okay. And then a kind of smattering of the others. Great. Thank you for participating. Okay, next slide. So now that we've set up the framework of God being the only one in control and this idea of Iblisi logic, which is the false hierarchies and assuming one person is better than the other, or one being or creation is better than the other, I want to talk a little bit about people, humankind. What does Islam say about the equality of people? Similar to Iblis and Adam being different, but just being different in their nature, we believe that all people are created different. None of us are the same as the other. There's no one, unless you, I think, are a twin, even you're walking around with the same genome, but every human is different. But in the Quran, in chapter 4, verse 1, God says that we have created you, God has created you from a single soul. So, and the word for soul in the Quran is nafs, N-A-F-S. Some of you may know this verse, and I want to highlight one thing when we're talking about the Quran and this issue of sexual assault, or even any kind of gender-related issue. In the translation that I have for this verse, it says, "O mankind, fear your Lord." They use the word man in a lot of translations of the Quran, and I think it's really important to, if you don't know Arabic or haven't studied it, it's really important to know that a lot of translations are done in a very patriarchal way. And actually the Arabic just is talking about "O people," not "O men" or "O women." Sometimes there is a binary, but a lot of times it's "Ya ayyuhan nas," which is "O people." Nas is people, not men or women, but everyone. And so just be really cognizant of that as you're reading through translations of the Quran. But yeah, this concept that people are created from the single soul is very important. We may be equal in creation, but have different roles and responsibilities. We may have different strengths and weaknesses. That doesn't make you inherently better than another person. That's obvious. And then, the Quran goes on to say that from both creation, the earth was populated. That's a reference to another verse in the Quran. I always highlight that there's an incredible reference to mothers in Islam, which is a disruption of patriarchy. So just to recap, kind of again, going back to basics of Islam, Islam was revealed at the time of ignorance. And one of the hallmarks of the time of ignorance was female infanticide, disrespect of women, seeing women as second-class citizens, as not as important or inherently valuable. And we saw that particularly with the practice of female infanticide. And Quran, in the Quran, one of the beginning verse, not the first verse that was revealed, but early on in the revelation of the Quran, God disallows female infanticide. And again, I think that we really need to call to question or call to attention that it was a time of ignorance because of this lack of respect for women. And we see that over and over and over again if we study Islamic law and its sort of feminist. I think that Islam isn't feminist. Islam is just equal. I mean, and actually gives a lot of more rights to women than men, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we see that certainly in the reverence of mothers. We see that in the financial rights of women, which are very clearly and explicitly commanded. We can talk about that in a minute. And then this idea of both having mutual rights. So one of you, when we were talking early on about misconceptions, we're talking about sexual rights particularly. Unfortunately, Islam has been maligned or misused to kind of imply that men have some kind of right to sexual access that women don't. And that is a huge misconception, a huge misunderstanding. There are a lot of people who are doing work like Heart, talking about how sex positive Islam is. In fact, for women as well, of course, we're women only. And I think it's really important to have that question and talk about the mutuality of sexual rights and sexual access. It's definitely not male centric. And I want to also call out the work of another friend and colleague. Her name is The Village Auntie. I don't know if you all are following her on Instagram and social media. She talks a lot about this idea of sex positivity from an Islamic perspective, and the right to pleasure and the right to orgasm. And I think it's really important to understand those issues. But we have a lot of good fans of The Village Auntie. That's great. So good. You guys have already learned all of that from her. And so I will move on to the rest of my my presentation. Okay, so we've been understanding the basics. We've been going back to the very beginning, to the core of the religion. And I want to talk more specifically about justice and accountability in Islam. So one of the things that we're trying to get across with this presentation is not to only disrupt this idea that sexual violence is not allowed in Islam. And that should be a no-brainer. That's an obvious. Of course, there's such a thing as marital rape because there's a concept of consent in Islam. Heart has an amazing t-shirt that says consent is fard. Fard is F-A-R-D. It means obligatory, it's a must. And I absolutely believe that. But unfortunately, beyond just getting to that idea that we shouldn't support, obviously, sexual violence in Muslim communities, it often shows, we have to often show our true colors when it comes to justice and accountability for survivors. And so I want to shift the story a little bit to that. A couple of verses in the Quran that address this issue of justice and accountability. One verse is verse 5, Surah 5. Surah is S-U-R-A-H. Verse 7, which says, "Be ever steadfast in your devotion to God, bearing witness to the truth in all equity, and never let hatred of anyone lead you into the sin of deviating from justice." The sin of deviating from justice. And then a command from God, "Be just." This is the closest to being God conscious, and remain conscious of God. Verily, God is aware of all that you do. So justice is a big deal from an Islamic perspective. This verse is telling you that it's a sin to deviate from achieving justice. And that should be hearkening for all of us if we think about it. And don't let your hatred of anyone lead you into the sin of deviating from justice. So be mindful of what might deviate you from achieving justice. And then early in the verse, again, to repeat it, it says, bearing witness to the truth. So truth is so important, and truth telling is important in achieving justice. And so, you know, this is just one of the many verses in the Quran that kind of highlights our commitment, or a Muslim's commitment to justice. And then on the issue of accountability, I want to recite a hadith for you. Hadith is Hadith. Hadiths are sayings or actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this is a very often repeated hadith, so you all may know it. It says in Sahih Muslim that whoever of you sees an evil, let him or her change it with their hand. And if you are not able to do so, then let them change it with their tongue. And if you're not able to do so, then hate it within your heart. And that is the weakest of faith. So I use this in this presentation as an example of our commitment to accountability. Often in the conversation of sexual assault, particularly, and you guys have already talked about this earlier on in the presentation, we have an incredible, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Muslim community. And I know that I am making a generalization about the Muslim community. I'm a member of the Muslim community, and I'm basing my observations on what I've seen across the country. But hopefully, you all do not, yes, I can share that. Hold on, let me copy and paste. Hopefully you don't get too upset with me for making generalizations of the Muslim community, but I will speak about, in my observation, in my observation, I've seen that Muslim communities often want to hide or silence survivors coming forward because of many reasons. Maybe they won't be able to achieve justice. Maybe there is some shame associated with it. I've heard from many women who have told me when they reveal that they are survivors years after the assault has happened, that they were fearful that they would never get married if they had come forward about their assault. So there's all kinds of issues that are tied into barriers to survivors coming forward. And I know that Hart will probably be covering those barriers in another presentation, but definitely religion is often tied into that. There's, notions of shame, and sometimes assault can be happening from a religious leader, and that calls into question all kinds of issues. And so, I think that this sunnah from the Prophet is really important. This hadith of saying, when you see an evil, change it with your hand. I mean, that's the first command. Do something about it. And if you can't do something about it physically, then say something about it. Use your tongue. And if you can't say something about it, at least hate it in your heart. And that's the weakest position, of just hating it in your heart. And I think, again, this is just a good reminder of us to stand up for the rights of survivors. It's a command from the person who is teaching us about our faith, which is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And with that, I'm going to get you to the next part of the case study, and I'm going to read it aloud. And thank you, Miriam, for talking about the concept of satr, S-A-T-R. I'm going to bring that up later. Okay, case study part 3. Susan gets home and decides to reach out to her best friend, Inaya, who supported her during her divorce. Inaya picks up the call and hears Susan out. Inaya asks if she could make a suggestion, that she file a complaint about Tahir. Susan says she'll think about it, but isn't sure. Refusing to be victimized like her ex-husband did, Susan arranges a meeting with Ahmed, the youth department supervisor, for the following day. Susan meets with Ahmed and relays what happened in detail, and ends by saying that she wants action taken against Tahir, that she shouldn't be able to work there anymore, and that she's handing in her resignation. Ahmed says that he needs time to consider her request and he will get back to her in a few days. We're going to give you guys a poll for you to tell us, what do you think is happening here? And while you guys are voting, I'm going to read your chats in the box. Okay. Okay, let's see what the results of the poll are. Oh, oh. Okay, so most of you feel Tahir should be fired immediately, 43%. 33% say Susan should not resign from her position. And then the next is 22%, reporting to her supervisor is the only option. Susan, oh, really? Okay, so 22% feel that so reporting to the supervisor is the only option. And then less popular answers, it would be wrong for Susan to decide not to complain. Oh, okay, it's on Susan's shoulders to ensure the Tahir is held accountable. Okay, I'm glad that less people feel. Okay, good. Well, that's really interesting. I want to spend some time talking about this, but I feel like in the interest of time, I need to move forward. So let's push forward on the rest of the content, and then we can kind of, hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to talk some more. We're almost done. Okay, so a note about justice. So we've talked a little bit about how do you achieve justice and what does justice look like? Of course, and just Islam's commitment to justice. So I want to just a quick note here that justice looks different to every person individually. And I think that that's kind of coming into the case study of Susan and Tahir. Justice for Susan could be not to do anything and just to go to her counselor or therapist or her friend Anaya and talk about what happened, and that's it. She doesn't want anything else to happen, and she may feel that that is justice served because she's just dealing with it. Justice to other people could mean going to law enforcement. Justice to other people may be to go and file a lawsuit or a protective order against the abuser. Justice could be him being fired. It could be any number of things, right? But I think we need to be very mindful of survivor-centric justice, asking the survivor themselves what they feel is justice. And then an issue on social justice. So for all of you who are working with communities, you may be not working with survivors specifically, but you are working perhaps with your community at large, with your agency, with your masjids or mosques or other religious institutions. And I think it's really important to talk a little bit about social justice. You have to really Muslims believe if we really put justice as a core of our religion, we have to have justice in every aspect of our life. You have to be just to your children if you have them. You have to be just to your spouse and your partner if you have them, to your parents, etc. And, I wanted to give a little bit of a comment here about social justice and change. So one of the things that you all can do is to help to disrupt and make changes in your communities to make sure that people are being, whatever the survivor feels, even if you're not working with a survivor specifically, can you help your mosque be more inclusive? Can you help your community group or agency or your friends be a little bit more understanding of issues around sexual violence and understanding of the intersection of religion and sexual violence. And I wanted to kind of give you all an example. So one example that I have is when I was working at Karama, I actually went to the Maldives because they invited, the Maldives is a Muslim country. Their laws are based in Islamic law. And one of the social problems that they highlighted and why they wanted Karama to come out was that women were being flogged in the public square because they were being accused of zina. Zina is Z-I-N-A. Zina can be translated as fornication or adultery. It can be either way. And men aren't being flogged, interestingly enough. So it was just women who were being flogged in the public square. And the country was really just at a loss. There were several women's groups who had invited us to really help to reform the legal system. And it's really interesting because even though the country bases its laws in Islamic law, there was just an inherent misunderstanding of the verses in the Quran that talk about zina, the requirement of 4 witnesses to the act of penetration, not to be too visual or graphic, but you have to have 4 corroborating witnesses to the act of penetration to prove zina, which is an incredible, for the lawyers in the room, it's an incredibly high burden to prove this. And if you go around accusing people of zina, you don't have the 4 witnesses, then you should be flogged. And that's part of the verse in the Quran. And I think that is really, it was just really not understood. And so they were looking to create social change in this country, in the Maldives. And I think that I try to bring up zina in this conversation a lot because unfortunately, many people want to equate zina and rape. And in the conversation on sexual assault, it's really important to, again, just, it's not funny, but to disrupt that idea. It's so absurd, which is why I'm laughing. It's so absurd that people would think that consensual sexual relations between 2 people outside of marriage could ever be considered rape. But unfortunately, that's part of what's happening in our communities, is that equation. Yes, we're 4 minutes to the end, so I'm gonna go to the next slide and talk about accountability. So I've already given you verse 5, 7, and I've already given you the verse, the hadith that we talked about. One more note on accountability. Look at the verse in the Quran 4:135, which says, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can protect both. Follow not the lusts of your heart, lest you swerve. And if you distort justice or decline to do justice, verily Allah is acquainted with all that you do." So here's another example of the Quran, in the Quran, of all of us being standing firmly for justice as witnesses directly to God, even if it means you have to go testify against the people that you love the most, your family or your friends. So I think that this is, again, sort of this a command from God that we have to have this commitment to justice and accountability. Another, really quickly, I wanted to talk about satr here and accountability. So quick note on something that's really important that one of you all mentioned. A lot of times in the silencing of survivors, there's this concept of, if it's called satr, S-A-T-R, if you hide your brother, sister, friend's sins, then God will conceal your sins. And so this is often repeated to survivors of, okay, so someone has committed a sin by assaulting you, and so you need to cover their sin, and then God will cover your sins. And God will, just have patience, and God will help you through this. I think that it's really an awful thing that this is used in the context of sexual violence. And while you guys do the next poll, I'm going to send you all an article from Dr. El-Hibri and Karama that addresses this particular issue in detail, and I'll put it in the chat box. So why don't you guys study or read the next part of the case study, and I'll grab that link. Okay, so really quickly, a few days later, Susan receives a call from Ahmed asking to meet as a follow-up. Susan enters Ahmed's office and is shocked to see Tahir there. "What's going on?" she asks. Ahmed calmly states that he wanted to get both sides of the story, so he invited Tahir in for a face-to-face. Ahmed asks if she'll give it a try, and not seeing a choice, she agrees and sits down. Ahmed turns to Tahir and asks him what happened that day. He recounts that he checked in with Susan after the class was over, since she was down 2 staff members and really stressed out. He goes on to say that she thanked him for all the support that she gave, and Susan took his hand and tried to pull him in and kiss him, and that he pushed her away, saying that he was married. He then turns to Susan, stating, "I know you're divorced and need company, but what you did was wrong. You hit on me. You've been giving me lustful glances since you were hired, even though I told you that I'm married." Okay, what do you think is true based on this part of the case study? I don't know how many of you all have responded. Let's see.
We're at about 20%.
Okay. I'll give you guys another quick minute, not even a minute, and we will finish. Okay, so 74% of you say that Tahir is gaslighting Susan, using what he knows about her to create a lie. Okay, and 48% of you say that Tahir is victim blaming and lying. Yep, that's true. 41% say Susan agrees to participate because there is a strong power dynamic present and she has little to no power in this situation. Yes. Okay. Again, another tricky responses, because many of these could be true. So we know that we're rushing a little bit now. We started a little bit after 2 o'clock, and so I wanted to, we're going to go past the time just a little bit. I only have one slide left, and I wanted to talk quickly about consent and agency in Islam. So we've already talked about how consent is fard, and we've talked about agency a bit, and women particularly having agency. And to that end, there's a paper that Hart commissioned from Karama talking about this idea of, particularly of agency and sexual agency. That article is also, I think, available. We can send it out to everyone who signed up. I don't have the link to it on hand, but in the article, it's particularly talking about a weak hadith, so it is not an authentic hadith, that says that if a wife refuses to have sex with her husband, the angels will curse her all night. I don't know if any of you have heard of that hadith. Again, it's weak. It is not authentic. There's a paper that has been written that shows the kind of, it's called ISNAD, ISNAD, which is the chain of transmission, which it doesn't have a authentic chain of transmission. But to the point of, have we ever seen an example of consent and agency in Islam? And there, in fact, is a story from the Prophet Muhammad, who was married to a woman named Safiya. And in that relationship, I'm just making sure I have her name correct. Yes, Safiya. Okay, so in that relationship, on the night of the wedding, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, went to Safiya's room, and ostensibly, or we assume that he was trying to consummate the marriage by having a sexual relationship. And Safiya refuses. She just says no to the Prophet. And what happens? And I'm going to read directly from the paper. The Prophet did not force himself on her. Of course he didn't. Nor did he admonish her or even question her about the reason for refusal. She didn't even ask why. He just said, okay, he accepted it. Shocking. And most interestingly, he did not tell her that the angels would curse her till the morning, which is, again, another feather in our cap that this is not an authentic hadith. And instead, he let her be. He treated her with courteousness, gentleness, and affection. So I think that that is just an incredibly empowering story that we should know more about. I actually did not know about that until this paper was written, and we will share the article with all of you. But I think it's really important to highlight that we have this amazing example of consent and agency from an Islamic perspective. And with that, we'll go to the last slide of the case study. This is, like I said, this is the last little bit of information. I'll let you guys read it. I understand if some of you have to leave, but we will finish while you guys read. We'll give you one more poll and then we'll move on. A few days later, Susan receives an email from Ahmed, which simply states, "Salam alaikum, Susan. Thank you for taking time to meet with me and share your side of the story. After careful deliberation, we feel that it's best for you to leave your position at the mosque. Given your history and interactions with Tahir, who has been a devoted staff member of our organization for many years, we're sorry to have to do this and wish you the best. Sincerely, Ahmed." A few hours later, she gets an email from the general mosque account. "Assalamu alaikum, dear community members. We pray that this email finds you well. As you may or may not have heard, we've had some conflict recently between a couple of our staff members. And in our commitment to transparency, we've decided to share our decision with all of you. Sister Susan will no longer be employed at our mosque. And while she is a skilled teacher, we agree that she's not a good fit for our community. Brother Ahmed will temporarily take over the position until we find someone to replace Sister Susan. Thank you for all the support during this challenging time. We pray that you all remain on the straight path, inshallah." Okay, this is the last poll. What do we think is true? Okay. Let's see what you guys say. Okay, 62%. Overall, this case study demonstrates aspects of spiritual abuse. Okay, I'd love to hear what you guys think is spiritual abuse. Type it in the chat box while I continue to read. And then a close second, 58%, Ahmed believes Tahir over Susan, given that Tahir has more power. Okay, why do we think that Tahir has more power than Ahmed, that with Ahmed than Susan? Is it just because he's a man? Is it because of his position? I would want to know. And then none of the other responses were even close, but the next most close is the broader mosques community has a right to know what's going on. Interesting. Okay, well, we can continue to share. I see that some of you guys are still typing and sharing with each other, so that's great. And I will take part in that conversation. Next slide. So a summary. So next week, just so you all know, there is going to be, as I said before, we're going to do a deeper dive into barriers of disclosure for Muslim survivors. So we will be covering that next week, same time, same place. We're going to have an online survey, which is great. Webinar recordings. I think Nabila had mentioned in the chat box that we'll be sharing resources with the permission of the presenters. And yeah, a plug to donate to Heart. If you like what we're doing, please support us with all of your heart and all of your generosity, because we're struggling just like everybody else amongst the COVID-19 situation, and generally small nonprofits are always struggling, especially ones who want to give women their rights. I'm just gonna, that's Aisha Rahman's opinion, not Heart's opinion.
Thank you, Aisha. Yes, and also I wanted to share that after this webinar is done, you will receive a survey. So we would love for you to fill out that survey just to give us feedback on how you're experiencing not only today's webinar, but also last week's. As Aisha said, we are going to have our third in the series of our webinar next week, and we are going to go deeper into parent control. And Aisha also did mention some bits about barriers to disclosure. So we're going to do a deeper dive with that. Also, I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on the online survey. HEART, like as I said before, we do research and we are collaborating with universities. And so we are going to be launching an online survey of research that we've been doing. So definitely be on the lookout. We will provide the resources, anything Aisha shared in her presentation today, we will also provide that to you all so that you can have access to it. So as long as you signed up. Another plug we would like to do is that if you would like to receive information from HEART specifically in terms of our programming and anything else that we are doing, please sign up for our newsletter. And lastly, if you do have any questions, I know some of you did have questions and wanted to speak offline, please feel free to email us. And with that being said, we also have a website and we're on Facebook and Instagram. And yes, definitely follow us. We're very active on there, and we're also sharing resources on our social media platforms as well. Aisha, please let me know if you would like to add any additional information, but this is
this is the end. I just sent a link to the article where you guys can download it. And you guys are you're chatting, and I think it's great. I wanted to read all of your responses. I want to be cognizant and respectful of everyone's time. I know we really, like I said at the beginning, this is just a teaser of starting the conversation. But I want you all to feel free to go. I'm just I wonder, is there a way to, there's a way to save the chat so I can maybe continue with you guys offline. Okay.
Yes, and also a big thank you to our ASL interpreters, Janice and Bernice.
Yes. Yeah, and if you guys want to continue the conversation with me, here's my contact information again, and we'll talk more, hopefully.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I will now end this webinar. Have a wonderful day.